Okay, so as we work with Web API, I've mentioned it earlier on, there's a few issues. There's this whole business of the chasing its tail, the cyclical references or circular references, whichever way you like to say it. And there are other issues as well. One of the things that I don't know if I pointed out with everybody or not, but in the controllers, you know, I'm going to go back to the Web API for a second here. If we come to any of the controllers, pick a controller, any controller, right? If I come down past the get ones, here things like our put, right? Do you remember when we did MVC controllers, okay, for, well, not so much the update, let's do the post. Post is an insert, right? What did we have right in this area when we had an insert, basically, a post, when we were inserting a record? Oh, that's okay. Remember we used that bind, right, to prevent over-posting attacks, okay? So we would say, oh, as we build this object, we're only going to bind these properties. So if somebody sneaky used a tool like Fiddler or something and trying to sneak and guess that I might have a property and provide false data, I was protected against that. Notice it says here, to prevent from over-posting attacks. Let me see if I click this link. Comes up to prevent over-posting, and it talks about using, DTOs, okay? That's another reason to use a data transfer object. It takes care of that vulnerability as well as the whole issue of the circular references and other vulnerabilities as well, right? So, getting back to the PowerPoint, JSON ignore, that attribute helped us avoid circular references. Also cut down the volume of data because we could say, yeah, we want our summary properties there maybe for other purposes, but we don't want them in the JSON data, right? But it's an imperfect solution because it doesn't deal with over-posting. Also, what if we have secret properties? Remember, the main example of doing that we put into practice last term was for audit, right? Our audit properties, so we'd have a basic audit trail of who updated the record and when and so on and so forth, right? Who created it and when. Okay, those properties should just stay on the server. They have no purpose going down to the client unless, okay, we have a special reason why we want them to. By default, we wouldn't normally want them. And we want to protect them, keep them secret, okay? We don't want everybody who can read the data to see that Jim Smith created the record, right? Maybe Jim doesn't want people to know that, okay? So, all of these issues, right, the circular references, over-posting, secret properties, they're all handled, they're solved by using data transfer objects. We mentioned before that basically DTOs, we use the concept, we called it a view model, right? So a DTO is just like a view model. It's just that it's specifically there for the purpose of preparing the data to go back and forth between the server and the client, right? So it's just a view model, okay? But I'll stick with the term DTO in the context of talking about Web API because that is a bit more descriptive of how we're using these view model objects, right? Now, some will be almost exact copies of the model, right? The actual entity models themselves that we use in our DP sets. But usually we leave out summary properties, for example, right? They don't need to be there. And the annotations for validation are optional, okay? Sometimes they'll be handy. And sometimes we'll use them with metadata classes then. Introduces another whole topic that we'll talk about. We actually could have utilized metadata classes the way we did the approach to some of our view models last term, but I didn't want to complicate things too much at that point in time. So we'll introduce that topic now. Basically a metadata class, in short, is just that all those annotations, we can move them out of the actual model class into a separate metadata class and then apply that same metadata to multiple different versions of our entity model, view models, and so on and so forth, right? It can contain all of our navigation properties without fear of circular references because we'll be in control of moving data back and forth between the entity model and over into the actual DTO object and back and forth. We'll control that code so there's no chance of getting circular references. Okay, and you might have lots and lots of special purpose DTOs for summary data. Maybe you think about reports, right? You know, we have group by queries where you're summarizing by this, min, maximum, averages, and so on. Put those into a data transfer object and send the data down, right? That's another reason we'll have DTOs later on as well. Okay, all right. So, as I said, circular references will not be an issue because we will stop the cycle of copying data over in our code, okay? We'll avoid unnecessary data because we'll leave them out, anything we don't want. Overposting attacks, secret properties, all this gets solved by using DTO objects. Now the challenge of using DTOs is copying the damn data back and forth, right? So you have your entity model, okay, with all the properties, your DTO model, you want to get the data from the database, put it over into DTOs. Unfortunately, it's back to actually writing first name equals first name, last name equals last name, and so on, right? But you know what? That's the price we pay. Now getting that code in place, thank heavens there's tools that can help us write all that. And I'll show you one. AutoMapper is a very popular tool out there. Has everyone heard of AutoMapper before? AutoMapper is a tool that basically says, okay, I have similar classes here. I want to instantiate this class of this type, but you know, almost all the properties are the same as this one. So map them over for me. Do the work of copying all the properties over, right? That's what AutoMapper does. Trouble is, it works, and it works very well. There's a downside to AutoMapper, though, because it's running all the time. So there's a performance hit with AutoMapper. And there can be other little issues that come up with it as well, right? And another thing is, you end up only, in a case like this, for what our purposes are, we're only scratching the surface of what AutoMapper can do. So there's a lot of overhead having this added to our project when we're only actually using a tiny bit of its capability, right? So we're going to look at using a very, very simple mapping tool that will help us write our code instead, right? You know, because it's hard to beat the performance of straightforward code where you say this first name equals this first name, this last name equals this last name. That's the most efficient way to actually do it in terms of the performance of your application. Okay, so mapping generator is the tool I like to use. By the way, I'll be honest, mapping generator doesn't seem to be really supported so much anymore, but it still works. So as long as it keeps working, I'm going to keep using it, right? And then you can find, there's all kinds of new people coming out with new tools. Feel free to research other ones that are available. But for my demo, I tested it earlier today and it still works, so I'm going to stick with it, okay? All right, no performance hit because we only use it at design time. It helps us write our code. And the code is extremely fast and efficient, right? And we have full control. After it generates the code for us, we can go in and modify it to our heart's content, which is exactly what we want to be able to do. So what's not to love, right? It's still available with a NuGet package, or you can just do install package mapping generator, right? In my copy-paste file, I actually have a version number. It was the last totally free version that didn't require any special license, so it does all we need to do. Okay. All right. So next steps, we're going to switch back to the Web API now. Okay. We're going to implement all this good protection, protect against overposting. All the stuff we're going to use by implementing DTOs, and eventually we're going to actually finally get to the CRUD operations as well, the insert, update, delete, all using DTO. So then we'll have a fully functional, secure, safe Web API up and running on the server. Then we'll come back down and we'll look at utilizing all the good stuff we put into that in the client again. So as I said, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. We're going back and forth between the server and the client, getting all the code that we want in place. Okay. All right. So just a little bit about metadata first, okay? We know that we have lots of metadata, all our data annotations, IVAL, datable object, and so on, okay? Database errors, right? We get errors raised in the database. How do we communicate them down to the client? Or we're going to accomplish all that in our next steps as well. All of our, you know, concurrency errors, unique constraints, and so on. We want to communicate all that information down to the client. So we're going to accomplish all that all at the same time. Okay. So that's the theory. So to get into practice, oh, I have one more PowerPoint. Just because you haven't done metadata class, have you done? Maybe I should ask, metadata classes. Okay, well, it's a very small PowerPoint. 2 slides of actual information, so we'll get through this one quickly. Am I still recording? Yes, I am. Okay, that's fine. All right, data annotations. We want to keep it dry, right? Don't repeat yourself, okay? So, trouble with having code that gets repeated throughout multiple places, if you update it in one spot, maybe you decide that, oh, for this particular property, we're going to allow a range between 1 and 12. But then later on you decide, well, no, we want to allow a range between 1 and 15. But if you have that same data annotation providing that range value in multiple classes, you got to make sure you remember to update it everywhere, right? So if we keep it dry, have it only in one spot, then any changes you make are easy. You update in the one spot that exists, and you have all the other classes inherit, so to speak. That's not the proper term because we aren't doing inheritance here, but basically getting the annotation from the one metadata class, right? And validation logic is best in one place as well, right? So in the model, we'll have our data annotations, we'll have our iValidatable object, bada bing, bada boom, okay? Even if we write our own client-side validation code, we know it's checked again on the server. Perfect, right? What about our view models and data transfer objects? We often want them to have the same annotations as the entity classes. And what if we change them? We don't want to take a chance on forgetting to do the update. So we can store all the data annotations in one class and apply them to matching properties in other classes using what's called a model metadata type. It'll make more sense when we see it in action, okay? So we make a copy of the original class, add the metadata to the name of the class, okay? Just to change the name so it's a little different. You could use something else, but I think metadata makes the most sense, okay? So if you had a to-do class, we'd make a copy of it and we'd rename it to-do metadata, right? It's just a naming convention. It's not an actual requirement, right? We can remove any properties from our to-do metadata class that don't have annotations because this class does nothing. All it does is it stores all the data annotations, right? And then we'll annotate the to-do class with, right on top of the class, model metadata type, type of, okay, and away we go, right? Then we'll apply all the annotations in the metadata class to the actual entity class itself, okay? And of course, we might need a using, but that'll be added for us the way Visual Studio works today with no problem. Okay. So this gives us 2 birds with 1 stone. What we'll find is with this approach, okay, it'll solve a couple issues. The view model or DTO object will have the same annotations as the entity model class. Okay, we'll create one metadata class supplying that information to both the metadata, the entity model and the DTO object, right? And we can change it in one place and away we go. If you end up doing eventually database first development, the scaffolding tool automatically creates these kind of classes. So I haven't shown you that yet. We've done all code first where we create our classes and have it generate the database. And you can take an existing database and have it create your classes, right? And when it does so, it defaults to this approach automatically. It creates metadata classes for everything. So we'll get a chance to see that when we get that far anyway. Okay, that's it. So don't repeat yourself, use metadata. All right. So we're ready to actually go on back to the web API now, right? So I'm going to stop it running. And our next step, step 4, we're going to switch the web API to start using data transfer objects. I think I'll stop and start the recording here though.